I was not supposed to be there. Palaces dispose of useless men quietly. Servants vanish. Advisors disappear. Relatives stop appearing at breakfast one morning and nobody asks where they went. I survived. I'm still not entirely sure how. Perhaps I was lucky. Perhaps I simply learned early enough to observe rather than speak, to step back rather than forward, to be the kind of man a room forgets is standing in it. And so I saw her. I was 12 years old. She was standing at the far end of a long corridor in the royal palace of Alexandria, completely still. The other children ran and shouted and made the kind of noise children make when they have not yet learned that noise can get you killed. But she just stood there, watching them, reading them. I remember thinking, who is this girl? Why doesn't she move? She turned and looked at me, and I felt something I had never felt before and have never felt since. Not fear, exactly. Something older than fear. The feeling you get when you realize the floor has shifted and you are no longer certain where the exits are. She smiled, then she walked away. And I followed. I don't know why, I simply did. I have been following her ever since. Her name was Cleopatra, seventh of her name, daughter of Ptolemy Auletes, king of Egypt. She was born into a world of silk and poison, of perfumed rooms and quiet betrayals. The palace of Alexandria was beautiful in the way that a trap is beautiful, all gleaming surface, all hidden teeth. Her family was Greek. The Ptolemies had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, but most of them never bothered to learn a single word of Egyptian. They spoke Greek at court, dreamed in Greek, governed in Greek. Egypt was something they owned, but never truly touched. She was different. She learned Egyptian. She learned it deliberately, methodically, as if she understood from a very young age that a queen who speaks to her people in their own language holds something no army can ever take from her. She learned Ethiopian, Aramaic, Hebrew. She spoke 9 languages before she was 20. She did not study languages to impress, she studied them to enter, to slip inside the mind of every person she might ever need. I remember watching her practice in the early mornings, the sun barely risen, the palace still half asleep. She sat at a low wooden table with her scrolls and her reed pens, and she worked with a focus that was almost frightening in someone so young. She never complained, she never drifted. When she was done, she rolled up her scrolls, set them aside, and moved on to whatever came next. I stayed close. I always stayed close. It was the only role I had, and it became, over the years, the only role I ever truly wanted. The palace was dangerous even then. Her father was a weak man, someone who bought favor from Rome with money he did not have, who wept in his private chambers while his kingdom frayed at every edge. Her siblings circled him like hungry cats. Her older sister Berenice had already tried to take the throne once. Her younger sister Arsinoe was always watching, always calculating, always waiting for a crack to widen. This was the world she was born into, not a childhood, a battlefield dressed up as a palace. But she learned it. She learned every corridor, every alliance, every whispered grudge. She walked through that place like she had memorized the weight of every stone beneath her feet. And when her father died, when the throne finally came open like a wound, she was ready. She was 18 years old. She had been ready for years. Chapter 2. Exile and the slow fire of survival struggle for power. She was queen. And then, without warning, she was nothing. Stripped of the palace, stripped of the throne, pushed out into the desert with only a handful of loyal soldiers and whatever she could carry. I went with her. Of course I went with her. There was no other choice I was capable of making. Her brother had done it. Ptolemy the 13th, 10 years old and already a weapon in other people's hands. His advisors, 3 men who understood that a boy king is easily shaped and a woman like Cleopatra is not. They turned the court against her. The army shifted. The palace doors closed. And just like that, the Queen of Egypt was sleeping in a tent in the Syrian desert. I remember those nights. The cold. The silence so vast and complete it felt like a living thing pressing down on the camp. She never fell apart. I need you to understand that. She never screamed, never wept in front of the soldiers, never let the mask slip where others could see it. There were moments, late at night, when it was only me nearby, when I saw something move across her face, something quiet and heavy, but she would breathe through it, and then it would be gone, like she had made a private decision and closed a door. She spent those months thinking, planning, sending messages, building. She understood something that very few people in power ever truly grasp, that to rebuild, you must first be completely honest about what you are rebuilding from. She met with tribal leaders. She negotiated with mercenary commanders. She wrote letters in 12 languages to 12 different allies. She sat in her tent every evening with maps spread across the ground, and she studied them the way a surgeon studies a body, looking for where to cut, where to press, where healing was possible, and where it was simply not. Power is patient. She had always known that. And exile, it turned out, was simply patience with sharper edges. I watched her during those weeks. I watched the way she carried herself even in worn traveling clothes, even with sand in her hair and exhaustion pulling at her eyes. She never looked defeated. She looked like someone waiting, like someone who had already seen the end of the story and was simply giving the present moment time to catch up. I asked her once, quietly, late at night when the fire had burned low, if she was afraid. She considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything. "Fear is a useful thing," she said. "It tells you what matters, but it is a poor advisor. I listen to it, and then I make my own decision." She paused. She looked out at the dark. "I am afraid of being forgotten," she said. "I am not afraid of being defeated." I have thought about those words many times since, in everything that came later, in the very end. Then word reached us. The Roman general Julius Caesar had arrived in Alexandria. He had come following another Roman, Pompey, who had fled there after losing a civil war. But Pompey was already dead by the time Caesar's ship entered the harbor. Her brother's advisors had killed him as a gift, they thought. Caesar had not been pleased. She saw the opening before anyone else did. She needed to reach Caesar. But her brother's men controlled every road, every gate into the city. Any attempt to enter openly would mean capture, possibly death. She thought about this for a long time. Then she sent for a merchant. She gave him very specific instructions, and she smiled, the particular smile she wore when she had already decided something, when the plan was fully formed in her mind, and only the world needed time to catch up. I knew that smile. I had already learned to both love it and fear it. Chapter 3. The night she arrived in a bundle of cloth, meeting Julius Caesar. She was rolled inside a linen sack. That is the truth of it. The most powerful woman in Egypt, smuggled into the royal palace of Alexandria in a bundle of fabric, carried on the shoulders of a Sicilian merchant in the dead of night. History will probably dress this up. Historians tend to. But I was there, crouched in a small boat rocking against the palace seawall, and I can tell you without hesitation, it was a sack. I was not with her for that part. I waited in the dark, listening to the water moving against the stone, watching the lights of the palace above. Every sound might have been her discovery. Every silence might have been her end. But she emerged, alive, somehow different. She didn't speak for a long time when she came back to the boat. She sat at the prow and looked out at the harbor. The city lights scattered across the water. The great lighthouse of Pharos pulsed in the distance like a slow, enormous heartbeat. Then, quietly, she said, "He is extraordinary." A pause. "So am I. This is going to be interesting." Caesar was 52 years old, brilliant, ruthless, carrying the weight of a civil war on his shoulders and the deep confidence of a man who has never truly believed he could lose. He had seen the whole Mediterranean world. He had conquered Gaul. He had crossed the Rubicon with a single legion and changed the direction of history. He was not a man who was easily surprised. She surprised him. I know this not because she told me. She was always careful about what she revealed, but because I saw it in the weeks that followed. The way he sought her company, the way their conversations stretched long into the night, the way he listened to her, really listened, with the full weight of his attention, the way men of great power almost never listened to anyone, let alone a woman they expected to simply charm them. She spoke to him in perfect Latin. He had not expected that. She debated him on philosophy, on governance, on the nature of empire. She challenged his ideas without ever being reckless about it. She knew the exact distance to stand from a powerful man's ego, close enough to be fascinating, far enough that he never once felt threatened. She was not seducing a man. She was building an alliance. She understood the difference. She always understood the difference. Within weeks, Caesar had moved against her brother's advisors, the men who had driven her into exile, the men who had been so absolutely certain that they could push a young queen out into the desert and simply move on. I watched her face as they fell. I was looking for something: satisfaction, relief, vindication. What I saw was harder to name. Something calm. Something like a person watching a mathematical proof resolve exactly as they had calculated it would. Not triumph. Recognition. She was reinstated as queen. She was 21 years old. She bore Caesar a son. Caesarion. Little Caesar. She was deliberate about this too. I want to be careful here because people reduce things. She loved that boy. Genuinely, completely, with the fierce and private love of a mother. But she also understood what the child meant in the larger world. A son by Caesar was a thread stitched between the two most powerful forces on earth. She held both of those truths at once and saw no contradiction between them. She traveled to Rome with Caesar. She saw the empire that had cast its enormous shadow over Egypt her entire life. She studied it from the inside, its vanities, its fault lines, the gap between what it believed about itself and what it actually was. She was learning, always learning, storing everything. Then Caesar was killed. The Ides of March, 23 stab wounds on the Senate floor, and the world changed again. She left Rome immediately. She came home. For 3 days, she sat in her throne room and held audiences and gave orders and was, to every eye that looked at her, completely composed. On the third night, I brought her wine. She was standing at the window, looking out at the harbor. She took the cup without turning around. "He was a great man," she said, quietly, without drama. "The world will be smaller without him." She drank. She said nothing else. And I stood with her in the dark because that was what I did. Because standing with her in the dark was the only place I ever truly knew how to be useful. Chapter 4. The Man Who Loved Her Completely. Love and Alliance with Mark Antony. There is a difference between a woman who chooses power and a woman who chooses love. Most people, looking from the outside, assume these are always the same thing, especially when the love arrives wearing armor and commanding legions. But I was there. I watched what happened when Mark Antony came. And I want to be honest about what I saw because it matters. Whatever else it was also real. She prepared for their meeting on the Cydnus River with her usual meticulous thoroughness. The gilded barge. The silk sails dyed purple, the color of royalty. Perfumed incense burned in silver censers, the smoke drifting to shore well before the vessel itself came into view. Musicians playing softly in the warm afternoon air. Everything designed, everything deliberate, everything chosen. She was not playing games. She was making a statement. A political one, yes, but also something deeper. She understood that to present yourself as a goddess is to make the audience willingly complicit in their own enchantment. People want to believe in something extraordinary. She simply gave them permission. People lined the riverbanks to watch. The marketplace of Tarsus emptied entirely, merchants abandoning their stalls, vendors leaving their goods, everyone moving toward the water to see what was coming. Antony sat in his chair on the shore, surrounded by his officers, and waited. She did not come to him. She sent an invitation for him to dine with her, aboard the barge, on her terms. He came. Antony was nothing like Caesar. Caesar had been precision, economy of word and movement, the elegant efficiency of a mind that wastes absolutely nothing. Antony was warmth and appetite and enormous, barely contained vitality. He laughed loudly and without self-consciousness. He ate and drank with real, unperformed pleasure. He was vain in the way that genuinely attractive people often are, but generous in a way that made the vanity forgivable. He was more sentimental than he liked anyone to know. She found him fascinating. I could see it from where I stood. Not the careful diplomatic fascination she had deployed with Caesar. Something more spontaneous than that, more unguarded. Something that moved in her face before she had time to decide how to arrange it. He fell. He fell completely and without reservation. He fell the way a man falls when he has spent his entire life being strategic and finally, at exactly the wrong moment, decides to stop. He loved her the way a fire loves everything it touches, completely, without the ability to do otherwise, and with absolutely no consideration for what might remain when it burned itself out. They spent the winter in Alexandria. He left his campaigns, his duties, his whole Roman life, waiting somewhere cold and distant, and he stayed. He watched her govern. He sat in on her council meetings, and I watched his face as he realized, slowly and fully, what she actually was. Not a queen he was visiting, not an alliance he was managing, something rarer than either of those things, something he had not encountered before and would never encounter again. Their formal alliance, when it was sealed, was the most powerful arrangement in the known world. Egypt's wealth, grain, gold, timber, ships, combined with Antony's legions and Roman authority. The Eastern Mediterranean was theirs. She governed it with a competence that still exhausts me to remember. Audiences at first light, correspondence until midnight, trade policy, military logistics, religious ceremony, diplomatic correspondence in 7 languages on the same afternoon. She held it all in her mind simultaneously, and none of it ever slipped. I remember one particular morning, the palace barely awake, the air still cool. She was sitting in her private courtyard with her 2 youngest children asleep across her lap, and she was reading a petition from a grain merchant in Alexandria, making notes in the margins, governing and mothering in the same breath, as if there were no tension between the two, as if it were simply what the moment required, and so she did it. Those were the years of her fullness, the peak of her power, the deepest happiness I ever witnessed in her, and I knew, even then, that it would not hold. I couldn't have explained why. Something in the quality of the light on those afternoons, perhaps. Something in the way that happiness, when it becomes too complete, too whole, always carries its ending quietly folded inside it. The way a letter carries its own burning in the same paper it's written on. Chapter 5. When the world began to tilt. The beginning of the fall. Rome does not forgive what it cannot control. I think she always knew this. I think she spent her entire adult life engineering around this single, terrible truth. But Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, cold and methodical and stripped entirely of sentiment. Octavian was something she had not fully accounted for. He was not an enemy you could charm. He was not a rival you could negotiate with. He was a different category of force, a new kind of danger. The propaganda came slowly at first, whispers in Rome, then speeches in the Senate, then pamphlets circulating through the streets, then everything, all at once, everywhere. Cleopatra the temptress, Cleopatra the Eastern sorceress who had bewitched brave Roman Antony and turned him against his own civilization. Cleopatra the foreign queen who wanted to rule Rome itself from her perfumed palace on the Nile. None of it was true. Every word of it was devastating. She read every report that came in, every intercepted letter, every translated speech. She sat with them in her private study and she went through them the way she went through everything, methodically, without flinching, with no comforting illusions about what she was reading. "He understands something I underestimated," she said to me one evening. She was very still when she said it. "He understands that you don't need to defeat a person. You only need to turn them into a story that frightens people." She set the papers down. "That is harder to fight than an army," she said. She was right. I have spent years thinking about how right she was. The war came, Actium. I will not describe it in full. Even now, the memory has an edge I cannot approach directly. The sea, the heat, the sound of the rams, the smoke that blotted out the sky for hours. The terrible arithmetic of a battle turning, shifting, going wrong in ways that cannot be corrected once they begin. Antony's fleet was broken. His legions began to defect. And in the enormous, suffocating silence that follows a catastrophe, she had to make decisions that no person should have to make. She made them. She made them clearly and without collapse, and that cost her something. I could see it costing her, though she never said a word. They retreated to Alexandria, back to the palace, back to the harbor, back to the place where everything had started. I had never seen her tired before, not genuinely tired. There is the tiredness of a long day, and there is the tiredness of a person who has been holding something immensely heavy for years without setting it down, whose body has simply begun to tell the truth that the mind has been refusing. That second kind of tired, that was what I saw on her face for the first time in all the years I had known her when they came back. She was still governing, still managing, still herself in every way that mattered outwardly. But something in the quality of her silence had changed. The decisions had a different gravity. The letters she wrote were different in their purpose. She tried to negotiate with Octavian. She sent envoys. She offered terms. She had spent her entire life transforming enemies into allies, and she applied every tool she possessed, her intelligence, her wealth, her children's futures as leverage, the measured reasonableness of a ruler offering a practical peace. He did not negotiate. He advanced. Antony received false information that she was dead. I do not know how it happened. I have never been able to fully piece together that particular sequence of events. What I know is that he believed it. And Antony, who had survived battles in Gaul, in Parthia, in a dozen desperate campaigns, could not survive that. He could not conceive of a world in which she did not exist. He fell on his sword. They brought him to her while he was still alive. She held him. She sat on the stone floor of the mausoleum, and she held him, and she spoke to him quietly. I was in the room. I want to be honest, I could not hear what she said. The words were too low, too private, meant only for him. And that is as it should be. Some things belong only to two people, and then to the silence that comes after. When it was over, she was very still for a long time. Then she stood, straightened, and she began to think. Chapter 6. The last night I kept watch. The final night. She bathed that evening. She asked for her finest linen. The blue of the Nile, she said, not the white, as if the specific color mattered to whatever she was preparing herself for, as if she was dressing for something that deserved to be met properly. She sat quietly while the remaining servants arranged her hair, and none of us spoke, because the silence had a weight that belonged entirely to her. She had always known how to make silence into something inhabitable. That last evening, she made it into something else, a room with only one door. Octavian had been clear. He would take her to Rome. She would walk through the streets of the eternal city in chains, the living proof that Egypt had been swallowed, that she had been broken, that Rome had won. I had known for days that she would never allow it. She asked me to bring her supper, figs, bread, wine. She ate slowly, with quiet attention. She talked while she ate, about the garden, about a letter she wanted delivered, about the children. She had made careful provisions for the children. She had made careful provisions for everything. She had always been that way. She wrote a letter to Octavian, sealed it herself, handed it to a messenger with instructions not to deliver it until after she had been found. I have spent years wondering what was inside it. I never learned. I do not think it was a plea. I do not think it was an apology. I think it was something only she could write, composed, precise, carrying the authority of a person who has already decided that the world's opinion of them is no longer a matter of pressing concern. She sent most of the household away. Only a small number of us remained. We sat together in her inner chamber. The lamps burned low. The palace was quiet in the way that places are quiet when something enormous is being completed inside them. She looked very beautiful, not soft, not ornamental. Beautiful the way a clear evening sky is beautiful, because of its depth, because of what you sense moving inside it. She talked a little, not about Rome or Egypt or any of the great forces that had shaped her years. She talked about Alexandria, the light on the harbor at dawn, the smell of the great library, papyrus and cedar oil, and the stillness of a room where enormous amounts of human thought have been gathered and kept safe. She had loved that smell since childhood. "I have had a remarkable life," she said at one point, quietly. Not as a performance, simply as a fact she was acknowledging before she set it down. I told her she had. I told her she was the most remarkable person I had ever known. I meant it completely. She smiled, a small, private smile. Then she looked back toward the dark harbor, toward the city she had loved and refused to surrender while she was still alive to defend it. The night moved slowly. The lamps burned lower. She asked me to stay close, so I stayed. I had always stayed close. It was the only thing I had ever been truly good at, and I did it that last night with everything I had. When Octavian's soldiers broke through the sealed doors in the morning, they found her already dressed, already still, already somewhere beyond the reach of Roman chains or Roman triumph. She looked like a person who had simply chosen not to get back up for whatever the world had scheduled next. The soldiers who entered, hard men, veterans, they stopped. They stood in the doorway and they were quiet. Not the quiet of men unmoved, the quiet of men confronted with something they had no words for. She had not been captured. She had simply finished. She governed Egypt for 21 years. She spoke 9 languages. She held an empire together with the force of a single extraordinary mind. She was called a goddess and a witch and a seductress by everyone who needed her smaller than she was in order to feel safe. She was none of those things. She was Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt. The last person who made me believe that one human being, with enough intelligence and enough will, could hold an entire civilization in their hands and keep it from falling apart. She was afraid of only one thing. She was afraid of being forgotten. She needn't have been. 2,000 years will pass. Empires will rise and collapse. Languages will be born and die. The harbor of Alexandria will change its shape a dozen times, and they will still be saying her name.